Wolfgang van Daele is one of those persons, if I understand his CV correctly, it's difficult to characterize him in terms of disciplines. He worked across several different disciplines, across nations, and I will just give you some hints on that. He was a director of the Department of Civil Society and Transnational Networks at the Social Science Research Center in Berlin. Then he was also a researcher at the Max Planck Institute, and lately he was a member of the German Federal Parliament's Select Committee on Opportunities and Risks of Genetic Engineering. And I think this is exactly where value systems are clashing together. And he is also a member of the National Board of Ethics of the Federal Republic of Germany. May I introduce, please, the floor is yours, and we are looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to talk about moral conflicts and the possibility to deal with moral conflicts via deliberation or rational argumentation. Let me start with a small characterization of the types of conflicts that we can envisage. I borrow from Albert Hirschman the distinction between divisible and non-divisible conflicts. Divisible conflicts are mainly conflicts of interests, where you battle about the distribution of certain goods that everybody desires: power, wealth, status, opportunity, and it's mostly a question of having more or less of the desired goods. And in this case, there is some susceptibility for bargaining and compromise. In contrast to conflicts of interest, if you have conflicts of values, it's about truth, right, moral duty, authenticity. Mostly it's a question of either or. You are either true or morally right, or you are, an assumption is false, or you are morally wrong. There is a kind of uncompromising atmosphere or attitude towards conflict of values. We normally think of values as better than interests. Interests are somewhat, well, we do not estimate interests so much. But in terms of the conflict dynamics, conflict of interests are much easier to handle, apparently, because in value conflicts the clashes are more apparent. There are some divisive ingredients. If you have your interests if you lose your interest, you are frustrated. If your moral values are violated, you get outraged easily. So moral argument is a dangerous weapon. And there is a rhetoric of injustice, irresponsibility, and immorality that incites public scandal and mobilizes resistance. Moralists are dangerous enemies. So you can easily say, here I stand, I cannot otherwise. And you insist on your position, and you do not compromise. There is always the possibility of what Ernst Bloch called the Gewaltrecht des Guten. So you claim a right of resistance and even a right of violence, because your values are so high that they must not be violated by anybody. The sociologist Niklas Luhmann put it that way: Moral macht kriegerisch. Morality or moral attitude makes irreconcilable conflicts. Max Weber, sociologists like to quote from Max Weber, first the German version: Es handelt sich zwischen den Werten letztlich und überall nicht nur um Alternativen, sondern um unüberbrückbaren tödlichen Kampf, so wie zwischen Gott und Teufel, Zwischen diesen gibt es keine Relativierungen und Kompromisse, wohlgemerkt dem Sinne nach. The English translation: it is really a question not only of alternatives between values, but of an irreconcilable death struggle like that between God and the devil. Between these, neither relativation nor compromise is possible, at least not in the true sense. But Max Weber was an empirical sociologist, and he knew very well that, in principle, value conflicts may be irreconcilable, but in social practice, we deal with them quite differently. In German: Das Verflachende des Alltags besteht ja gerade darin, dass der in ihm dahinlebende Mensch sich der teils psychologisch, teils pragmatisch bedingten Vermengung todfeindlicher Werte nicht bewusst wird und vor allem auch gar nicht bewusst werden will, dass er sich vielmehr der Wahl zwischen Gott und Teufel entzieht. English: the shallowness of our routinized daily existence consists indeed in the fact that the persons who are caught up in the struggle of values do not become aware, and above all, do not wish to become aware of the partly psychologically, partly pragmatically conditioned motley of irreconcilable antagonist values. They avoid the choice between God and devil. The way how we avoid the value clashes is that we keep some kind of indifference towards values, even towards our own values. We live in a kind of inconsistency. We sometimes pursue that value, then we don't take it that serious any longer if we get into trouble, so we pursue another value. We do not relativize the values, but we put them in context, and we segment our life, and we segment our societies. And the historic model for this is religious tolerance. So it took a couple of decades of fierce wars until the societies developed a mode of coexistence, a modus vivendi, how to deal with absolute values of religion and still do not go to war. The solution was, in a way, to privatize the religion and make it a matter of personal belief and not of societal-wide validity. During this is the acceptance of value pluralism in society. And in this case, the religious rules and duties, which are true commandments for the believers, became a matter of private choice for others. So sacred values became treated as mere preferences, mere matters of choice. So in liberal society, what is sacred is substituted by the respect for the person, by the respect for the rights of individuals to choose and to live up to what they consider as sacred. This is a nice device to cope with irreconcilable value conflicts. The question is, does it work everywhere? And I'm now going to bioethics. There we have moral conflicts. The speaker before me just mentioned abortion. We have pre-implantation, genetic diagnosis, research with human embryo stem cells, euthanasia or assisted suicide for terminally ill patients. We have to be aware that pluralism is more or less difficult depending on what kind of moral issues are at stake. We have a quite wide acknowledgement of pluralism for questions of what constitutes a good life. These are, let's say, sexual behavior. It is easily accepted that people can pursue their own way of life, their own pursuit of happiness according to their personal moral values in that area. Pluralism is also accepted for the commitments to moral ideals. How much solidarity should I grant? How much should I help others? The so-called positive moral duties. There we accept divergence among people according to their own moral valuation. We have much more difficulties, many more difficulties, if it comes to moral rules, like, say, human rights or the protection against harm. There we normally do not accept pluralism. So if people say, well, my value is that women are inferior to men and therefore should be treated, should not be treated equally, we normally become intolerant. So the question is then, where does the moral conflict reside? Does it go more into the direction of moral ideals or more into the direction of moral rules? And the challenge is that in many of the conflicts of bioethics, the moral rules are at stake. And therefore, pluralism is a real challenge. I'm now going to the question of whether deliberation is a good means to cope with such moral conflicts. And I'm taking the example of the National Ethics Council in Germany, in which I was a member until 2007. Deliberation is the use of words in order to persuade or to discuss a problem, to analyze a problem, to come possibly to a common solution. But as we all know, words are not always the road to reconciliation. It can also be otherwise. And again, to quote from Max Weber, in political communication, the words used are not plowshares to loosen the soil of contemplative soil must be, but swords against the enemy. Such words are weapons. And Thomas Hobbes said it much earlier and very briefly, the tongue of man is a trumpet of war and sedition. And in the bioethical conflicts, we often hear the trumpet of war. For instance, if a bishop argues that those who allow for abortion are like, they induce a holocaust of babies, or doctors who say that who advocate stem cell research for patients are like the Nazi doctors in the concentration camps. You hear these voices, and of course this is not deliberation in the sense as we envisage it. In the National Ethics Council, of course, such trumpets of war were not heard. And that is due to certain constraints on the rhetoric that is imposed through that are imposed through the constellation. In such a deliberative procedure, we have face-to-face communication of people who are, by definition, labeled as equals. There is no asymmetry of power. There may be an asymmetry of competence, but that is easily compensated by the right of everybody to invoke experts on their side in order to help them to understand issues. So there is really, this is a kind of face-to-face communication without a power differential, at least not in terms of resources to which you have access. Everybody, every person in the deliberation is arguing about morality, but they have to proceed from putting their moral claims on the table and discussing the moral claims. Because as soon as they have put their attitudes on the table, the other side is also putting moral attitudes on the table, and then the discussion proceeds by discussing various moral attitudes, which means you go a little bit at a distance to your own moral position, because you now consider it a subject matter for analysis. You also proceed from interest to justification of interest. Of course, everybody knows that people have strategic interests. They want to put their position in the law, for instance. And there is no doubt that all kinds of strategic elements are in the communication. But these strategic elements are displayed, they are exposed, and then the continuation of the discussion is in terms of, have you good reasons to pursue that interest? That is also apparent in the public discourse. When you address the diffuse public, you always use arguments, but the situation is very different in the sense that in the public discourse, you can pursue those arguments where you are very confident of, and forget about counter-arguments. You will never address the counter-arguments unless you can easily refute them. That is done. In the deliberation, there is no way to escape the need to give an argument, to listen to counter-arguments, to give evidence if it is necessary. So there is this kind of the full semantic space of reasons that can be brought to an issue is present. And it is always possible to add a new argument at any point of the discussion. And of course, you have time to do that. So such deliberations take many hours, sometimes many days. And you have to ascribe sincerity and authenticity to the other. The plain reason is the discussion would immediately stop if you tell somebody, well, but you really don't mean it. You hide something. You have a hidden curriculum. Yeah? This is not possible in deliberation. So there is a kind of rationality in that is imposed through the constellation of deliberation, and it's a kind of learning environment. And it's different from the effort to persuade a diffuse public, where you address what the previous speaker talked about, and in a way you have better conditions for learning. In the end of our deliberations, we disagreed. So, in all the major moral issues that were discussed, we ended up with split votes and we could not agree. But this kind of disagreement was different from the disagreement with which we started. I call it an irrational dissent in the National Ethics Council. It was clear that all parties argue from a moral point of view. So it's a discussion about different morality. All available moral reasons have been reviewed, and they do not warrant an ambiguous conclusion. There is dissent despite much common ground was discovered. During the discussion, it was very clear that all the participants agree on major moral values like human dignity, the respect for human rights, personal integrity, and so forth. So the parties first built up a common universe of morality that they shared. And then they discovered that on top of this common morality, they had some dissent, which makes it a little different. So you cannot say, well, he lives in a completely different moral world. We all discovered we live in a common moral world for most of the issues that are important, like you have to bear responsibility for the consequences of your action, you have to respect human rights, you have to display solidarity and so forth. So there was this idea that we belong to a community of moral values, but we have still some differences. So that relativizes the extent to which the dissent is important. And therefore, it was not possible to solve the moral conflict by labeling the other side as insane or criminal or incompetent. Now that's the way, if somebody really doesn't accept the right to life, the right to live, well, we would say, well, he must be insane or he is criminal, yeah? And we expel or excommunicate them from the community of morality. That is not possible in such a deliberative setting. So what is the case then in the case of rational dissent? From an observer's position, the outcome of the deliberation is that there are diverse and inconsistent value commitments, and these value commitments are sustained throughout the deliberation, so they survive deliberation. The efforts to integrate all the available arguments into a well-reasoned equilibrium, like John Rawls advocated it, failed, or let's say they yielded two different attractors. So you can have a moral view of this side or of the other side. And apparently it means that the cultural repertoire of the society lacks generally accepted standards to distinguish between the moral stances taken by the conflicting parties as true or false or morally right or wrong. I mean, in these deliberations, we treated many of the claims on truth and morality as something that is accepted throughout the society. The philosophers who in seminars always tell us that there is no absolute truth and everything is socially constructed and so forth, they may be right in the seminar context. This doesn't count at all on a pragmatic level. On a pragmatic level, the things that count is what is the state of affair in science and what are the commonly accepted moral values. And that's enough for all pragmatic and political contexts. The rest can be left for the philosophers, and any attempt to bring the constructivist epistemology that we discuss in philosophy to the practical context of political deliberation or moral deliberation would just be a fallacy of misplaced constructivism. Yeah. And therefore, in the discussions, the philosophers kept silence. They never tried to go to the principles of utilitarianism or deontology, and so that was outside. The common morality of everybody, of every person, was the basis. And the discipline that had most influence on the discussion were the constitutional legal scholars, because they represent, so to speak, the petrified moral values that have found consensus in the society in a historical period. So much for the distance to the philosophical background or the underground of all our discussions about validity claims. They didn't play any role, and I had many discursive procedures. I never found that you could make a point by going to that level. So this is what I would conclude is that from an observer's position, you find moral pluralism as a social fact in the society. Interestingly, though, let me summarize how that came about. The moral commitments were treated as a subject matter for analysis rather than a resource of crusades. You had a lot of perspective taking despite confrontation, so people disagreed, but they tried to understand the positions of others, and they even tried to find good reasons within the framework of others, and pointed out, well, but you are inconsistent on your own assumptions. So they were involved in understanding the other's positions, which is a lot of perspective communication, and there was the potential to proceed from moral communication, where you say, here I stand, to communication about moral values. Yeah? What are the moral values in the society? But there were definite limits of the deliberation, because what was apparent from the observer's perspective was not easily acknowledged by the participants. So we had the moral pluralism documented for the observer, but not acknowledged by the participants. And the reason is that the acknowledgement of pluralism puts an asymmetrical burden on the conflicting parties. Pluralism is everything what the liberal part of the liberal parties want. They have won the case if you accept pluralism, because then you have the question of private choice, alternatives. You can choose, and you can say, well, everybody has different values. All values are moral values. So how do we do in a modern? What do we do in a modern society if we have different values? Tolerance and respect for the other person's values are the solution. So the liberal have an easy victory if pluralism is acknowledged, whereas those who favor rigorous moral controls have a defeat. That's why the people from the church and the people from the disability studies in the National Ethics Council, they refused to put pluralism as the outcome of our deliberations in the final reports. In a way, they tried to escape from the impositions of reflexivity. So they wanted to keep the learning processes low and or to curtail the learning processes, at least when it came to the question of what do we write down for the public. So they gave the staff of the National Ethics Council, there were 3 scientists, not a mandate to analyze the contested issues. So the staff was more or less jobless. They were well paid, but they had no job, because the participants wanted to keep control of what arguments came up. I mean, they couldn't keep that control because the other side always brought these up, but they didn't want to give the staff this kind of a third-party role, where from a neutral perspective they could collect all the arguments. They refused to put the pro and con summaries in the final report. So they didn't want to have the public read what kind of arguments are against, what kind of arguments are pro, and how these arguments have been proceeded. We several times, I belong to the liberal parties, we several times proposed to document the way of our discussions, but that was too much reflexivity and too much relativization apparent for the public, so they didn't want to do that. And they didn't put any discussion of the meta issues of how do we regulate in a society in the case of dissent. How put a discussion? We discussed that, but and of course we came up with the question of pluralism and what is legitimate pluralism, what is not legitimate pluralism. But they avoided this as soon as it came to writing the reports. So there was a retreat from collaborative report writing. In the end, both sides wrote their own statements, which were then from the liberals put down that there is pluralism and we have to deal with pluralism, and the other side put down that their own moral position was the ethical minimum. Yeah? And so they fell back into the original position, despite all the deliberation. But being mandated by the German parliament or the government, they of course had to make some concessions. And the concession was, everybody agreed that the conflict resolution has to come about by parliamentary decision. So democracy trumps morality. This is of course, it is clear from the mandate they had that nobody could deny this kind of resolution, and that was put down in the reports, and it was also implied in the procedure that we handled the reports to the government and to the parliament. This is a kind of solution that has interesting features, because if we consider the meaning of democracy, it means mostly majority decision. But majority decision is not a decision on what is morally right, but a decision of how should we regulate, if we must regulate somehow, how we proceed in the society. So it's political will, not moral validity, which you can see from the, let's say, the framing, that it is understood that if the majority were a different one, a different regulation could be put in place. And if the majority changes, the regulation might as well change. So it's a temporary, provisionary rule that regulates the kind of coordination of conflicting views in the society, but does not decide who is morally wrong and who is morally right. That, of course, makes it a little bit easier, and one could think of that the democratic proceduralization is a way of translating the indivisible value conflicts into divisible conflicts of interest. Of course, this is also an observer's remark. So we could say, well, if we take seriously what does it mean to have a majority decision, it would translate the value issue into an issue of interest confrontation. But of course, it's more difficult for the participants to see this not as a moral defeat, but only if they don't win their point, to see it not as a moral defeat or a violation of the moral rule, but just as a defeat of interests where they can campaign for winning the next time. And even the members of the National Ethics Council had some ambivalence about the proceduralization. They could not avoid it, of course, but they behaved a little bit ambiguously, because as soon as they had left the arena of the deliberative arena of the National Ethics Council and went to the public, they again began to insist that their own position is the only one that is acceptable, and that in fact the parliament was not free to decide the one way or the other, but because it's part of the dignity of man that is in Article 1 of our Constitution must not be compromised. And so they threatened even with the Constitutional Court if the Parliament would really take this as a mere pragmatic decision of majority rule. So the question now is, the final question is, do we have a broader role for deliberation in coping with indivisible, and now I include religious and moral conflicts, because the religious conflicts may be more up to date or more coming, maybe the more pressing ones. In principle, moral rule and political liberalism operate towards acknowledgement of pluralism. But fundamentalists will invoke moral pluralism as long as they are in a minority position, but will they stick to moral pluralism once they have the majority? The sociologist Steve Bruce in the United Kingdom, he had coined a nice phrase. He said, fundamentalists will retreat to sectarianism and claim for tolerance as long as they are sectarians. You have the history of Christianity. Christianity was, Christians were a minority, and they were happy, very happy about when tolerance came about, because then they could at least display their religion within their small communities. And fundamentalists of any kind will be happy to enjoy tolerance, and they will advocate pluralism in order even to secure a small place where they can display their own way of life. But it doesn't mean that could be a tactical retreat. And when it takes several centuries of living in this tolerant and pluralist definition, you may have become used to tolerance. And of course, the history of Christianity may have, in that way, helped to make this distinction between the two Reiches, what is Caesar's and what is God's thing, and to distinguish between the state and the religion. But it may not be as easy if you don't have this long period of sectarian retreat. Deliberations may accommodate moral clashes in the society better if they proceed from argument to bargaining. What we found in our discussions was that when we had this clear-cut split between the two moral positions, then the conflict was relegated to democratic procedure. But sometimes we said, well, let's find a way where we have a consensus. And then we agreed on interesting compromises. For instance, in euthanasia, we said, well, we will not advocate to allow euthanasia in Germany because of the Nazi experience, which comes up all the time. But we would say, well, if somebody uses euthanasia, he should find a mild court and should not be punished. And we were able to say in consensus with all the parties, with the churches, that we should not allow euthanasia for terminally ill patients, of course, voluntary euthanasia, in Germany. But if nevertheless, in cases of conflict, people use euthanasia to help relatives or doctors to help patients, then we should consider not to punish him. And that was the final sentence of this report. And it was a remarkable concession. So it is a kind of inconsistency, of course. But inconsistent solutions may sometimes be better than clear-cut principles. And the case of abortion regulation is a good example. The United States have a wonderful, clear statement from the Supreme Court. It's pro-choice, and it is legally consistent, and it satisfies all legal scholars. The German regulation of which was advocated by the Supreme Court is utterly inconsistent. So they say that abortion is illegal, it's rechtswidrig. But nobody can enforce the legality, namely prevent people from having an abortion. This is if you have a legal system and are legal theorists, it's utterly inconsistent and it's bad law. But it is good law in the sense that it pacified the conflicts. We have bitter conflicts in the United States and we have virtually no conflicts in Germany. So negotiation may be the better solution than majority rule. So deliberation is not necessarily a blueprint to accommodate moral clashes, but muddling through with compromise rather than all or nothing majority rules may be a way out. And in any case, regulations should be conveyed as exercise of political will, not as execution of moral order, in order to avoid that people feel violated in their basic values. In the end, political surplus can be derived from deliberation. Deliberations de-escalate moral conflicts by committing the parties involved to a reflective attitude and mutual respect, which constrains moral outrage and moral zeal, as long as deliberations last. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your personal experience in this really interesting but also difficult and challenging field. Now the floor is open for questions. Yeah, there in the back. Can we have a microphone?
Thank you very much for this very interesting analysis. I have a question concerning the symbolic value of the National Ethics Council. You haven't said very much about that, but one could argue, and there is, in the meantime, a whole sociological literature around that, that a very important function of these ethics councils, national ethics councils, like in Germany or in France, is in many respects symbolic. The fact that they exist is what matters, and it symbolizes uncertainty. It symbolizes that the government is not sure how to proceed with certain delicate issues, and that it involves wise people, professors who come together, who deliberate, discuss, but what exactly comes out of that is usually not that important. Something comes out, but it's quickly forgotten. But to some extent, one could see these ethics councils, in particular, if they are this national ethics council on a high presidential, whatever, level, as an acknowledgement that there is a great deal of uncertainty out there when it comes to these touchy issues you have been describing, and that in itself has a value, and to some extent also symbolizes this demise of the culture of experts and experts telling us what to do and what not to do. It's sort of keeping the floor open. How would you think about this symbolic value of National Ethics Council deliberation?
I mean, all these institutions have symbolic value, but there are good cases where especially in stem cell research, where this was a kind of preliminary step where you inform the government and the public about the state of affairs. And in this case of stem cell research, importing stem cells in Germany, embryonic stem cells, there was an important parliamentary debate and there was a decision afterwards. In many other cases, the government pursues a non-decision strategy because they see the clashes of value, and they don't want to touch these things again. Especially in all those cases where abortion is somewhat in the background. All the parliamentarians don't want to touch it. We even had a sequence in the discussion where the liberal parts pointed out that it is highly inconsistent to forbid pre-implantation diagnosis but allow post-implantation abortion. So the official regulation in Germany is you forbid pre-implantation selection of embryos, but you allow post-implantation abortion of fetuses. And you force the women to undergo provisionary pregnancy, then they can choose. We pointed this out, and they felt that this is a very difficult issue. But then they said, do you really want to reopen the abortion debate again? And we said, no, we don't want it, because we are not sure how that will develop. So, and the government is in the same position. They don't want to reopen certain moral debates because they are not sure that this goes in the right direction. And what happens? Now we have court decisions that somehow liberalize access to pre-implantation diagnosis. And of course we have tourism of patients to Belgium and other countries. And the government refrains from regulating that, but still it is very clear that the function of the National Ethics Council is, the government says we have done something, we have relegated the discussion to that, but the function is also to expose the kind of factual pluralism in the society. And in many cases, we don't need regulations.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, please. Yeah, and there we have a question afterwards in the back.
Well, I have a difficult question. You explained to us how the sectarians make the whole story difficult. Now, sectarians are everywhere, or not everywhere, they are always coming. What can we do to avoid the development of sectarism?
I think we cannot avoid the emergence of sects. We can also only deal prudently with them, and one prudent access is to tolerate them if they accommodate to certain basic values, and then give them space for living their own life in the terms of the Constitution. Everybody has a right to pursue his way of happiness. But of course there are limits, and if the sectarians require and demand that we do not allow, that they are exempt from, let's say, human rights. In Canada there was this decision about the Muslim communities. They wanted to have the Sharia, but only for themselves. Yeah? Which of course means that the members of the Muslim communities can have no access to the human rights of the liberal state. That is unacceptable. So you have to pose definite limits on what sects can have, and of course they must not go to violence, they must respect the human rights and the constitutions, but then there is a lot of space to allow them to display their way of life. And of course minarets in mosques belong to this space. Yeah? This is a disastrous decision. Yeah? And the veil, of course, is a question. The veil in the public is okay. The veil in the state institutions may not be okay. So there is some breadth of regulatory flexibility that has to be discussed, and it has to be discussed in deliberations where you have the representatives of these sects within the discussion of how do we deal in the society with the diversity of projects of living and belief and values.
Okay, I think we have a question in the back.
Thank you. You were mentioning the historical example of moral conflicts, the religious conflicts. I think you were thinking of Europe since the 16th century, and you were mentioning as a solution kind of privatization of these values. And I was asking myself, wouldn't this be also a solution for at least some bioethical conflicts? I think of abortion, prenatal diagnosis, and maybe euthanasia. What do you think about that?
The problem with this solution is that it's a solution of the liberals. Yeah? I mean, we all advocate, the liberals all advocate this solution. But it is difficult if you are morally convinced that abortion is murder to accept that murder is a matter of private choice in society. So if you want to murder, you can murder, but you of course cannot be forced to murder. So, and this kind of framing makes the whole difference. And the question is, how can you overcome this kind of framing? And what the deliberations can do is to bring about this kind of consciousness that the other side, they are not just murderers, yeah, but they have a different moral view, but a moral view. And that's a very difficult learning process, and you can try to install this learning process, and of course you can also try to impose laws where people are forced to accept these differences, and hope that after a while they will adapt to that. I mean, the religious tolerance was forced upon the people by the states, by the emerging states in the 17th century. Yeah? And after a while, it was clear that this was a liberal right, so you had tolerance. But it took some time, and it's also a very painful learning process.
Okay. We have one last question over there.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I would like to make a statement about the dangerousness of moralists you've mentioned, because I must say it's a slight overestimation, because moralists, in my opinion, can only be dangerous if they can make a direct linkage to the everyday life of people. An abstract moral discussion won't reach the people, and therefore they are not dangerous. Take, for example, the Minaret Initiative, you've mentioned it. There were moralists on both sides. The supporters talked about the Islamization of Switzerland. Those who were against argumented with international law and the freedom of religion. The only problem here is that if you talk with the people about the European Court for Human Rights, about international law, about abstract jurisdictional moral topics, yeah, they won't have any linkage to those, and they really won't believe you. And in this context, I would thank Professor Lepierre for his statement, because it's really important to make these linkage, and therefore deliberation is good and right, but still there must be some linkage.
Yeah. I'm not sure whether I see a difference. Of course, it's different to have deliberations and then to persuade a diffuse public in regulatory debates in Parliament or in campaigns for a referendum. Yeah, there's a difference, and you can only try to infuse the public debates with some of the elements that you have in deliberations, and that happens. So we analyzed the genetic engineering referendum in Switzerland, and so you can find some of these elements there, of the discursive rationality. With respect to the minarets, of course there may be groups that find the decision on minarets so humiliating, so such a matter of disrespect, so that becomes an indivisible conflict. Yeah? So there may even be terrorist acts. I mean, you have to, then they must be isolated from the rest of the community. But the solution would be to consider minarets as a question of normal construction laws. Yeah? And that is a solution that is favored in Germany. So minarets are discussed as administrative matters of construction law. How high must a building be? How far from other areas? And are there, and it's a zoning question, and so you bury the moral issue within such pragmatic decisions, and that's a good way to deal with it.
Okay, so I think we stop here, the first part of this morning, and go to the coffee break. But before, I would like to thanks again Professor van den Daele. I think he did an excellent job, and we really enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. So may I ask you to